Hello, and welcome to the Science of Reading for Multilingual Learners, Effective Early Literacy Instructional Materials for Multilingual Learners. This is our webinar number 2. My name is Renee Scarin, and I'm the Senior Advisor of Content at the English Learner Success Forum. And I'll be introducing our fantastic panelists and moderating today's panel. Please use the chat to introduce yourself, share ideas and resources with other attendees. And please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions directly to panelists. The Q&A will be monitored, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as we can, either in the Q&A feature itself or to the panelists in our Q&A towards the end. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Jim Cummins. He's the Professor Emeritus at Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Sue Pimentel, co-founder of StandardsWorks, Meredith Liben, director of Reading Done Right, and Rebecca Blum Martinez, ELSF's dual language national advisor and professor emeritus of bilingual education at the University of New Mexico. So I will introduce each panelist a little bit more extensively before they give their initial comments. But before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to remind you about ELSF. We are an equity-driven nonprofit committed to providing multilingual learners with the education they deserve. As a forum, we bring together specialists, including researchers, leaders, partner organizations, educators, and educational leaders to advocate for centering the needs and assets of multilingual learners. Our primary focus is on core instructional materials that are quality, research-based, and responsive to all learners, but especially multilingual learners who have been given short shrift often in instructional materials. At ELSF, we believe that language and literacy development should be in service to learning knowledge and in service to skills. We learn how to speak, listen, read, and write, and interact with others in schools so that we can do something meaningful with language. In other words, to build knowledge, to gain skills, to engage in the world, to accomplish goals in our lives, to participate in the world. We don't believe in waiting for students to gain language skills before they are able to participate in grade level instruction. All of these things should be happening simultaneously. The purpose of language is to make meaning and fulfill goals defined by the social context in which the language is used. So people use language, literacy, and other communication resources in various ways as they engage in a variety of activities for real purposes. So language then is seen as an action used to do things meaningfully in the world. And you can see this is a scholar that I shared that quote from. The webinar is a second in a 4-part series. You first heard last month from state and local leaders about their perspectives on adoptions and creation of literacy materials in the materials marketplace. In our second webinar, the scholars today will share the research-backed fundamental components and design features of responsive literacy development and materials. And session 3 will feature Professor Lily Wong-Fillmore, educational linguist and multilingual learner literacy scholar. And she's going to walk us through an early literacy unit that she designed with multilingual learners in mind. And then session 4 will bring together literacy scholars who focus on writing development as an essential component of multilingual learner literacy development and what that should look like in materials. The essential questions we hope to answer today. What does the science say about core literacy materials and instruction responsive to multilingual learners? So what are the strengths and gaps in current early literacy materials? So what are the important components of Spanish biliteracy materials, and what is missing from the current marketplace as it relates to materials that support literacy in 2 languages? So what is the role of teacher guidance and literacy? Each panelist is going to speak for several minutes before we go into a moderated discussion with all of the panelists. So please remember again to include your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, renowned educational linguist, Dr. Jim Cummins. I spent a great deal of time in graduate school reading the solid second language acquisition research generated by Dr. Cummins, and he's had a profound influence on the field, advanced the causes of multilingual learners in the areas of bilingual education, academic language and literacy development in multilingual school contexts, cross-language transfer, identity issues in schools, and on and on. He's a professor emeritus at OISE at the University of Toronto and a tireless advocate for research-informed literacy policies and practices. So I recommend you read his most recent book, Rethinking the Education of Multilingual Learners, a critical analysis of theoretical concepts, published by Multilingual Matters. Dr. Cummins will frame the scientific evidence around effective literacy instructions and materials before our next panelists go more deeply into specific aspects of literacy. So Dr. Cummins, please take it away.
Okay, thanks, Renee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I hadn't expected to be part of this webinar, but I happened to be staying with my good friend Lily Wong Fillmore, and when a panelist dropped out from the original team, she, as Lily is wont to do, volunteered me to be part of this panel. So I feel like I'm coming off the bench in a high-stakes NBA game, and but I'm really, really happy to be here. So let me just go ahead and share my screen and take it from there. Let me comment first on the title of my presentation, Designing Materials and Instruction for Initial and Sustained Reading Development. Must be based on all of the scientific evidence. And that, let me just, title implies that many of the policies that are currently being implemented are not based on the totality of the scientific evidence. And this is not just a scientific issue, it's also an ethical issue. Where policy decisions and curriculum development decisions directly affect the educational trajectories and the life trajectories of millions of children. And this is particularly true in the case of children from low-income backgrounds, children from multilingual backgrounds, and also those from racialized communities. And so part of where I'm coming from is a desire to go beyond the adversarial discourse that has characterized this area and move towards a more constructive two-way discourse where we can look at the issues, look at the research, and talk respectively to each other. So let me just move on, and let me give you an overview of what I want to talk about. First of all, I want to say that I'm a strong proponent of the science of reading, understood as the proposition that reading instruction should be based on an accurate interpretation of the totality of empirical research regarding effective reading and literacy instruction. Unfortunately, however, although there's a large degree of consensus among researchers about the essential components of effective literacy instruction, and this is reflected, for example, in the special issues of Reading Research Quarterly that were published a couple of years ago, the science of reading movement has been fueled by journalistic and media accounts that typically contrast phonics instruction with balanced literacy, and the latter is frequently castigated as non-scientific. And policies based on these assumptions that are currently being enacted and mandated across the United States, I would argue, are highly problematic because they typically emphasize phonics and other foundational skills to the exclusion of 2 other foundational building blocks that are supported by massive amounts of rigorous empirical research. namely the importance of literacy socialization in the preschool years and literacy engagement throughout the grade levels. So what I want to do is to propose what you could think of as a big picture framework that I believe is consistent with the perspectives of the vast majority of researchers. This framework emphasizes the centrality of creating an ecology of literacy engagement in the early grades. I believe that this will go a considerable way to bridging the dueling dichotomies in reading instruction and bringing state and district level policies into alignment with what the scientific research is actually saying. So that's where I want to go with the presentation. So first of all, I want to acknowledge some of the positive developments in current debates about reading instruction. I mentioned the special issues of Reading Research Quarterly that had 50 articles written by researchers from across the scientific spectrum, in terms of reading research. And Amanda Goodwin, who's co-editor of the Reading Research Quarterly, when these issues were developed, did an interview that appeared in Kaplan, where she reflected on the state of the art in terms of research in reading acquisition. And I'll just pull out some of what she said in relation to this to highlight the fact that there is extensive agreement among researchers about most aspects of initial reading instruction. Amanda said, we did not hear calls for the sort of narrow directive approach to reading instruction that journalists and policy advocates often promote. I just don't see anybody talking about a battle between science and non-science. She talks about the article that Donna Scanlon and Kimberly Anderson wrote, where they reviewed 25 years of rigorous experimental studies in which kids were given systematic phonics instruction and also taught to use context clues to help them when they struggled to sound out words. And what they found was that kids tend to become more successful readers when they get both kinds of instruction compared to those who get phonics alone. In short, Amanda says they found that more resources are better. It's self-defeating to insist on an either-or choice between phonics and context cueing, as though these practices were at war with each other. It's much more helpful to treat them as complementary. She goes on to say there's no single way that is a magic solution. I've learned that the science of reading is most effective when it is broad, bridges perspectives, and has the goal of sharing accurate, evidence-based, and meaningful understandings that can move us forward. Another positive development in the current scenario is the joint statement that was put out some time ago by the Reading League and the National Committee for Effective Literacy. The Reading League is associated with the science of reading. The National Committee for Effective Literacy is a group of experts who have focused on multilingual learners. And over the course of quite a number of meetings, these two groups came up with a joint statement expressing some consensus in the with respect to the science of reading and its implications for multilingual learners. I've just pulled out a couple of statements that they make in this joint statement. So one of them is that foundational skills such as phonemic awareness, phonics, decoding, and encoding are explicitly and systematically taught to impart the phonology and orthography of the language of instruction. There is no debate about this. I know of no researcher who does not agree that phonics instruction is important. They also say that instructional emphasis must also be placed on oral language development and English language development for English learners in order to ensure that students are not simply decoding or attempting to decode words that they do not understand. They make the point that a student's home language is an asset that should be valued and nurtured because of its intrinsic value and because it can be used to leverage second language acquisition and second language literacy development. Instructional practices in which teachers explicitly encourage students to make connections between their home language and English benefit their language and literacy development. They also make the point that whenever possible, students should have access to dual language instruction in which a student is able to learn in their home language and in English to work towards the goal of positive literacy outcomes in both languages. Now, obviously, the first point here in relation to the teaching of foundational skills is central to many of the revamped policies that are being implemented. But I think there's much less focus on and much less emphasis on the other 3 points that I made. There's certainly still quite a bit of misunderstanding and ambivalence about the relevance of students' home languages for their acquisition of literacy in English. And these are issues that I think we need to constantly come back to policymakers and materials development experts to highlight the fact that students' home languages are not irrelevant to their learning of English and to their literacy development in English. Okay, moving on to the second point that I want to make, and that's that the science of reading movement, and I'm talking about movement in relation to the totality of discourse that associates itself with the science of reading. Researchers are part of that movement, but journalistic articles and media articles and lobbying is also very much part of that movement. I'm going to argue that this has been fueled by highly inaccurate journalistic and media accounts that typically contrast phonics instruction with so-called balanced literacy. And as I said, the latter frequently castigated as non-scientific. I've included some citations down below that have looked at these issues in detail. But if we look at where the recent debates started with Emily Hanford's work, as Maren Aukerman points out in some of the articles that she's written about this, Hanford makes 86 mentions of phonics instruction and only a single reference to any other aspect of literacy. So obviously the focus here is on phonics as the solution. She says the sum, this is Hanford, the sum of the National Reading Panel research showed that explicitly teaching children the relationship between sounds and letters improved reading achievement. The panel concluded that phonics lessons help kids become better readers. I think that's a relatively non-controversial statement. But then she goes on to say balanced literacy was a way to defuse the words over reading. It succeeded in keeping the science at bay, and it allowed things to go on, to continue as before. And this is a theme that comes up over and over again in the journalistic articles. I've just shown one example, an article written in the New York Times by Dana Goldstein. And the title here, the headline is "An Old and Contested Solution to Boost Reading Scores," in other words, phonics. And it says the subtitle is "As Text Scores Lag, there's a growing debate between proponents of the science of reading, which emphasizes phonics, and traditional educators who prefer to instill a love of literature." That is a totally spurious opposition and contrast. Goldstein says in, I forget whether it's the first paragraph or second paragraph, but early in the article, the science of reading stands in contrast to the balanced literacy theory that many teachers are exposed to in schools of education. That theory holds that students can learn to read through exposure to a wide range of books that appeal to them without too much emphasis on technically complex texts or standing out words. This is irresponsible journalism. This totally ignores what the theory around balanced literacy is saying. It totally ignores the work of Michael Presley 25 years ago that argued in detail what balanced literacy was and is, and I'll come back to that point. But if we do a reality check, the National Reading Panel is consistently invoked within the science of reading, the journalistic accounts. What is almost never mentioned is that the National Reading Panel endorsed a balanced approach to reading instruction. Balanced literacy, or the National Reading Panel also showed results in terms of systematic phonics instruction that are much less sweeping than is typically the way in which these results are presented in journalistic accounts. For example, they reported that systematic phonics instruction was unrelated to the development of spelling and reading comprehension for normally achieving and low achieving students after grade 1. There was a relationship for students categorized as reading disabled, because by definition, almost these students are students who have difficulty in decoding. But for normally achieving and low achieving students after grade 1, the effect of systematic phonics instruction was essentially zero. An article written by panelists on the National Reading Panel made this explicit. They say among the older students in 2nd through 6th grades, phonics instruction was not effective for teaching spelling or teaching reading comprehension. The panel cautioned against one-size-fits-all approaches and emphasized that systematic phonics instruction should be integrated with other reading instruction to create a balanced reading program. Contrast that with what you've just heard from Dana Goldstein and Emily Hanford. The panel also advocated the use of high-quality literature and cautioned that phonics should not become the dominant component in a reading program, neither in the amount of time devoted to it, nor in the significance attached. They expressed concern about the commonly heard call for intensive systematic phonics instruction and drew attention to the possible negative effects of scripted programs. Okay, if we move on to what the research is actually saying, I want to propose a very simple framework for understanding what the research is saying and for developing whole school strategies for effective reading instruction. And there is a massive amount of research on the impact of literacy socialization and literacy engagement that has been largely ignored by science of reading media advocate. It has not been ignored by researchers, and I know of no researcher who will dispute the broad form of what this research is saying. There are some of the references down at the bottom there that I draw on for this. So this is the framework. As you can see, it is pretty straightforward and transparent. There's just 3 components in it. First of all, it's saying that if we are serious about promoting effective reading development or strong reading development, we need to look at the first 5 years of life. That's when the vast majority of brain development happens. And there is all kinds of research evidence showing that the extent to which students have access to print in those years, the extent to which they're listening to stories, tuning their ears to what text sounds like, that has a very significant effect on children's literacy development. And we know also that children growing up in poverty, whose parents don't have money to buy books because they're struggling to put food on the table, those children often tend to have considerably less exposure to print than their more affluent peers. So we need to ask ourselves, what kinds of interventions, what kinds of supports in the preschool years can increase the proportion of students who come to school primed for reading development. Then there's within the K to 12 range, there are 2 aspects that are important. We should be focusing on demystifying how language works right across the curriculum. I've used the term language and literacy awareness and focus on that. Teaching phonics, teaching the alphabetic principle, teaching foundational skills are a major part of that. But I'm using this term in a broader way because we should be thinking about developing language awareness right throughout K to 12. We may start off looking at structural aspects of the language and how the sounds of the language are related to the printed language, but we also want to move into critical language awareness and critical multilingual language awareness. And where we look at the social dimensions of language. Language is obviously used to illuminate, it's used to inform, it's also used to deceive and disempower. And our students, if we want democracy to survive, need to be tuned into how that happens and to be critically aware of what they can do to counteract that. But the other aspect of this is language and literacy engagement. And there is a massive amount of research showing that reading volume matters, that the more students are exposed to text, the more they become actively engaged in text, the more they're motivated to read, the better their reading comprehension skills develop. And not just their reading comprehension skills, but also their access to foundational skills. And obviously there is interaction between a focus on demystifying how language works and providing an ecology of language and literacy engagement. These 2 are not independent of each other, they interact. And this will ideally promote, if we do this well, this will promote strong academic language and literacy development. So that's the big picture that I wanted to highlight. If we look just briefly at the preschool setting, Many of you are obviously familiar with the work of Louisa Moats, a strong proponent of phonics instruction. But in an article written a few years ago, she and a colleague highlighted the importance of reading aloud to children. Reading aloud to a child is a critical activity in helping a child gain the knowledge and language skill that will enable good comprehension later on. Reading aloud increases background knowledge, builds vocabulary, and familiarizes children with the language and books. They point to research that highlights the additional benefit of interactive story reading that encourages active listening and engages children in dialogue about the story by means of open-ended questions. So the point I want to make here is that there is a huge amount of research highlighting the central importance of what's happening in the preschool years. And we're looking at literacy engagement, we're looking at literacy socialization, and opportunities for literacy socialization vary across the population. And we can have immense impact if we focus in on those years. Just to highlight a couple of research findings. Reading to children, even in their first years of life, pays considerable dividends. There's a research study by Leach and colleagues that demonstrated the unique effects of shared book reading to infants at 9 months of age on subsequent vocabulary development at 36 months. Neuroimaging studies have confirmed these effects and identified brain regions that are directly affected by patterns of literacy socialization in the early years. But you can look at the current discourse relating to the science of reading, and you'd be hard-pressed to find anything much said about literacy socialization in the early years or during the early years of schooling. So the takeaway from this is that despite the fact that no one disputes the importance of preschool literacy socialization, it's rarely mentioned in debates about the science of reading. Low-income and many emergent multilingual children typically experience far less access to print in their homes, schools, and neighborhoods than their more advantaged peers. I did a conservative calculation and estimated that there's about 4,500 hours difference in literacy socialization between children who are coming from homes where there's a lot of exposure to books, a lot of reading alouds by parents and other caregivers, compared to children who have minimal opportunities to get access to print. 4,500 hours. Obviously, that's going to make a difference. And intervention at this stage will pay major dividends. And yet, we're not talking about it. I'll just make a point here from a recent article by Elfriede Hebert, where she and this is following up on other work that Freddie Hebert did. She edited a book called Reading More, Reading Better. But she makes the point that nobody disputes the fact that proficient reading is built on automatic recognition of consistent and common sound patterns. This finding does not need to be reinvented or debated. But she also makes the point that students acquire and use statistical regularities in language to become more proficient readers. And this has direct effects on decoding skills as well as on reading comprehension skills. And she references the work of Mark Seidenberg here. This is a quote from her article. She says, readers build connections between phonemes and graphemes through encounters with patterns in the words that they read. The more that students read, the more frequently they will encounter common and consistent patterns. This frequency, in turn, leads to increased automaticity in recognizing words with patterns when they encounter them. The frequency with which words appear in language and the volume of text students read work together to ensure successful learning of both rule-governed words and their irregular neighbors. She also points out that there's minimal evidence for the impact of text decodability or memorization of phonics rules. So to wrap up, I want to highlight the importance, the ethical importance, as well as the scientific importance of going beyond the current dueling dichotomies in this area. What I've tried to say is that reading instruction and the development of reading materials for both multilingual and non-multilingual students should take account of the scientific research that points to the importance of, first of all, promoting language awareness, including phonics and other foundational skills across the curriculum, And secondly, creating an ecology of literacy engagement that maximizes students' opportunities to read and write extensively, build knowledge, and actively discuss issues and topics that are relevant to their lives. This, it turns out, is the essence of the castigated balanced literacy instruction that was outlined in the National Reading Panel and also by Michael Presley and colleagues more than 25 years ago. Presley argued that balanced reading instruction entails a lot of skills instruction in the context of extensive engagement with literacy. And I think this is a sentiment that's consistent with the views of most researchers, but not necessarily with the reading policies that are currently being enacted. The reading policies that are currently being enacted place a huge emphasis on increasing the intensity and the extent of phonics teaching in schools, but you are hard-pressed to hear anything about the importance of literacy socialization or literacy engagement in this. So if we're only basing our policies on 50% of the research, we're unlikely to be effective. And this is illustrated. For those of us who can think back 25 years, this is illustrated in the disastrous implementation of the $6 billion Reading First program in the early 2000s, which had no impact on reading comprehension or engagement because of ideology rather than science determining the distribution of funds. So thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to responding to any questions that might arise later on. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to answer some of the questions for Jim at the end of our panelists' remarks, but we're going to move into the next one. Thanks, Jim, for really stressing the ethical importance of following the actual science and not the media outlets looking for clickbait. So as you said, we need to create an ecology of literacy development. So let's meet our second panelist, Sue Pimentel, national leader in literacy development. She is best known for her work leading the development of some of the nation's most highly regarded college and career-ready standards in English language arts and literacy. She's widely respected for her success at facilitating complex conversations around standards and their implementation. Sue has a deep commitment to producing high-quality results characterized by stakeholder buy-in and has a gift for making this happen. I'm excited to hear from Sue about the essential role of knowledge building in literacy, instructional materials, and instruction, especially for multilingual learners.
Sounds great. Thanks, Renee, and so glad to be here. We can just go right to the first slide. Yeah, so I'm going to broaden it too, Jim, the notion of science of reading, to making sure that knowledge building is a pillar of that, because indeed it is. And here again, as we talk about listening to the research, there's as much settled research about the importance of content knowledge as there is about the importance of structured phonics. And so it's a both and, sort of as Jim has been talking about, not an either or. And when you think about it, even if you didn't know the research, right, you know that reading is a meaning-making endeavor. And if I'm decoding something, I have to make sense of what I'm reading, right? And so I have to have knowledge in order to do that. And here's the most wonderful thing, and that is that it's a virtuous cycle. So the more students know, the better readers they become, the better readers they become, the more knowledge they gain, and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the power of knowledge building, and perhaps the first slide does that. So that the third bullet down there is that content knowledge compounds over time. It builds on each other. The more you know, the faster you learn. But I also don't want to forget, and this is, I think, Jim, you were getting to some of this, that knowledge builds curiosity and inspires children, right? So you can imagine that sometimes you hear kids like, oh gosh, school, blah, blah, blah. But if they're learning about sea mammals or weather or the American Revolution or, you know, the Incas or whoever, it's so much more powerful. And it's also an equity imperative. Jim talked a little bit about the inequities or the way that students come to school with their wonderful selves, with different experiences and different knowledge, right? But when you have a knowledge building curriculum, then you level the playing field. Everybody's going to learn about, oh, I don't know, sea mammals. And then you learn together. And it's part of that both engagement, I think, Jim, and also this notion of a social community. And the other great power of knowledge building is what it does with vocabulary. So when you go deep into a topic, when you go deep into an area of knowledge, and you read a series of texts, your vocabulary gains by four times that than just a decontextualized list of words. So the bottom line is that knowledge about the world and words fuel both reading comprehension and critical thinking. So I want to get to the next slide, and I've got Lily Wong-Fillmore standing by because so much of what's on this slide she taught me. I was a author of the Common Core State Standards in Literacy and in English Language Arts and Literacy, and I was able to be part of the Understanding Language Project where I first met Lily. Gosh, Lily, how many years ago was that? 14. And what was interesting to me and troubling to me was this notion that we made English a bridge that ELS or multilingual learners had to cross first before we taught them anything of genuine interest in science or history or art or math. And so that needs to stop. And what Lily, and I'm going to stop here when I do this bullet, Lily, and have you underscore something, but what Lily taught me as I sat back and thought about language is that language is in a context. I think, Renee, you might have mentioned this as well. And that is that, what's being communicated, who's communicating it, to whom, for what purpose. And so you can't learn language in isolation. You've got to learn language in context. And Lily, I'm just going to stop for 1 minute to see if you have anything to add there. I'll keep going until Lily, I see the little thing come off on Lily's thing. So how does multilingual learners learn a language? By engaging with it, by thinking about it, by discussing and writing about the topics, right? And Lily's always been good about saying that English learners, multilingual learners require amplification and enrichment, not simplifying the linguistic text of instruction. Okay, Lily, you're on. I think
we finally figured out how to unmute. Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that it takes children time to get their ears accustomed to a new language. When you are new to a language, you don't necessarily hear all the sounds, and you don't hear for quite a while. You can't differentiate all of the unusual sounds that you're encountering, and so we've got to think about how much time it takes children to get their ears wrapped around the sound system of a new language before they can begin to deal with learning to match up symbols to those funny new sounds that they're getting. And the sounds are not the same depending on the environment that they occur in. At the beginning of syllables, a sound might be in one sound like one thing. At the end of a syllable is quite a different sound. In combination with other sounds, what is unusual now becomes mush, sheer mush. And so, I think that we've got to think about how much time it takes kids to get their ears wrapped around the sounds of a new language before they can start learning to read in it, right?
Thank you, Lily.
I'm gonna mute myself.
I think this may be a quote from you. We need to spend more time and attention on educating ELs, not just focused on turning ELs into English speakers. I do believe that is a quote from you that I've used time and time again. Let's go to the next slide, because I'm going to dig in a little bit here about what you should be looking for in your materials. And I know Lily's going to do a whole session on this in the next session of this webinar series. But I'm just going to go through like some of the things to look for. So the first thing is that the organizing force for the materials is about coherently and systematically building knowledge of words in the world. That's its purpose. Yes, they want you to learn how to read and write and listen and speak, but you learn that through your content. And then the next one is affording every student access to focused, close communal reading of content-rich, complex text. Like, this is another place where you have said to us time and again, when we say every student, we mean every student, because that doesn't happen all the time. And Jim, I might tell you that in a balanced literacy program, students don't always have close communal reading of content-rich, complex text. They do a lot of reading. There's a lot of love of reading, but not necessarily the communal reading of content-rich, complex text. And why is that important? Because you don't get the vocabulary you need. Those students that are denied that, they don't get the work with the complex syntax. They don't get the concepts that they need from that. And so what's really important is that there's this sense, again, Jim, of socialization that happens where peers are learning from one another. And these can be read alouds, because we just heard Lily talk about oral language as being, and I'm going to dig into that in a little bit in the next slide, how important that can be as well. And they can be complex for really, really good reason. The next, and I think, Jim, you talked about this too, was how important it is to provide a volume of reading, right? So that students can read more accessible texts on a topic where one text bootstraps another. So that you read a text on a topic and it's accessible, you read another one, it bootstraps, you read another one, because the vocabulary, sometimes it's the same, sometimes it's similar, because it's about a context. And this is a place where I think home language text can be really, really useful for students to be able to get their knowledge up in a particular topic before they have to tackle a complex text. And the next is making sure that what the program does is it assigns writing and collaborations that are tied to what students are reading and learning. And why is this? Because they support one another. When I have to write something to communicate something, whenever we do, I learn it better. And when I talk about it in a group, I learn, like when I was listening to Jim talk today, there were nuances of things that he taught me that maybe I didn't know before or hadn't tuned into before. And so that's really helpful as I move along in my own learning. And the next one is, and I think I think Renee, you kind of pointed to this, and I think Jim pointed to this as well, intentionally and incrementally building knowledge from the earliest grades up. Now that might seem like a duh, why, of course, but have you ever heard of this, the notion of first you learn to read and then you read to learn? And I think Jim disabused us of that notion. We know that anyway, when we look at, children that we know that are 1, 2, 3, 4 years old, haven't even gotten to school yet, and how much we want their knowledge to be built. All right. Okay, get ready, Lily, because May wants you here too. So this is about the importance of oral language development. We just heard from Lily about how when you're learning a language, the sounds are different, right? The syllables are different. The rhythm of a language is different. How you pronounce things is different. And one of the things that we know is that this is for all students, not just multilingual learners, is that listening comprehension far outpaces reading comprehension until about the middle school years. So that doesn't mean students shouldn't be, shouldn't be learning and reading, right? But it means that you can really use topically related read alouds to be powerful, because they expose students to the words and the syntax and the content more sophisticated than they could read on their own. And Jim, I saw that you had a publication by Susan Newman, and she has a interesting study that came in 2017, 2018. And they took topically related read alouds in science for a whole year, and they did a control group. And of course, when they did the read alouds, they did lots of conversations and parsing the language and the words and the phrases and so on and so forth. And then they assessed students, these were 4 and 5-year-olds, at the end of the year, not by a written test, but however, and they found that the students who had been exposed to these wonderful read alouds about science topics knew more content, right? And knew more vocabulary. And one of the stunning results, maybe stunning, maybe you all on the phone already, or on Zoom already sort of know this, is that the multilingual learners outpaced the native English speakers who got the same treatment. So I don't know that that was a surprise to the researchers, but it was there. So it's powerful. And then the next one is highly interactive collaborative discussions. You can't learn to speak and listen unless you listen and speak, but also about what. So you want to talk about the content, you want to talk about the text, you want to talk about things that are important, that the students feel are important and interesting. And this gets into the socially constructed notion of learning, so that when I listen to somebody, when somebody listens to me, we have an exchange of ideas. We may argue a little bit, which is fine because it helps hone our own ideas. And it helps build out the knowledge. And through listening and speaking, you build your language. It's just kind of obvious, rather than having a teacher always up at the front of the room, and that gets tiring for them too, just sort of yakking away. And the next one, and get ready, Lily, because after I do this one, see what you want to underscore or enlarge or fight with me on. And that is that we have to focus on the words and phrases and clauses encountered in the reading, or if you're being read to, right? So that students can sort of deconstruct what has been said. What does this phrase mean? What does it mean here? What does this word mean here? What does it mean there? What is this? How does this sentence add something to this paragraph here? It's interesting for students to do that. And it happens, through playful and formal talk. Can be formal too. You can have a time of the day where you do that as well. But again, responding to what it is you read. And I want to see if Lily has anything she wants to add here.
Wow, Sue, you said it all. You really said it all. But I just want to add this thought, and that is, we talk about academic language, but in fact, what is really critical here is the language of literacy, the written language, which is so different. It's
Yes.
so different from oral language. So children who have been read to have got sort of a sense of how the ideas are packed together in structures. In written language is different enough so that it almost constitutes a separate variety of that language. You don't get all the insights into how language works, into how a new language works, until you have been exposed to these various forms of language, various ways ideas get expressed in the language. And that's the real benefit of these stories that are read to children, which they may or may not understand fully, but they're getting the sounds, the rhythms, the intonational contours of the language, which help to parse out the structure of the language before they are even starting to read. And that just gives them a running start into the fact that there are these different forms of language. There is the language of ordinary spoken discourse, when people talk to you, when they scold, when they give advice, when they cheer you up, and so on. And then there is this formal language that appears in written form, which is so different that you have to get to a point where you can figure out, oh, that's why they are saying this, or this idea comes in. Now, things get tucked into written language that are not done so in spoken language. But you've already said it, so there you go.
Lily, thanks for that. And I'm going to zippity-doo-dah through the next couple of slides so we have time for our other presenters, which are so important. I just wanted to show you the difference. There was a young student, she was in third grade, where she wrote something about endangered animals, but when she read one text, and then her mother, who was a teacher, gave her a whole lot more texts. And look how much more she wrote about. She wrote about more endangered animals. She wrote about how they were endangered, so on and so forth. So you can just see, and I love her little quote up above, which is, "I learned so much by reading so many books." You can go to the next slide. So it just shows you going deep on content. Kids love it. The next one, I'm just going to let you read through it. The main thing here I want to say is that the organizing force for lessons for approaches that don't serve teachers and students are isolated standards and strategies. So that the text isn't at the center, the learning isn't in the center, content takes a back seat. And you can move all the way through it where texts jump around, writing is siloed, and level texts are prominent where different students are given different texts. And the whole notion of level text, this may create some controversy, but the whole notion of level text is just silly. It's silly. There are certain topics that I can read really well, and there are certain topics I have trouble with. So this whole notion that we have a certain level for each student and we hold them back just doesn't work. I just wanted to leave you with something happy. And that is that it's from a superintendent of Tennessee. You can read through the quote yourself. But I just want to say, I think one of the things here, she moved from a bloated, probably Basel program, I do believe it was Basel, and moved to a knowledge building curriculum. I think it was Wit and Wisdom. And here she says, students have more to say, both orally and writing, and they're leading conversations. I mean, what could be better than that? So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Renee, and thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sue. Your remarks and of course Lily's underscore the importance of units, building units of instruction that allow students to build knowledge, vocabulary, language around a topic. And we at ELSF really promote the research that shows that multiple exposures to and opportunities to use specific topical language and language structures over time allow students to build that language into their linguistic repertoires. Our next session in April, as you know, Lily's going to walk us through such a unit. I'd like to welcome our third panelist, esteemed education leader and founder and director of Reading Done Right, Meredith Liben. She is currently an independent reading consultant and author of 2 books about reading. She works supporting selected literacy projects and promising new initiatives in ELA curriculum and adult basic education. She taught for 26 years in New York City public schools, including 2 schools she started with a small group of colleagues. She led literacy work at Student Achievement Partners following the Common Core state standards. She also directed the text complexity validation research study for the Common Core state standards, multi-decade career in educated. We're really excited that she can share just a little bit of her wealth of experience and insights on the topic of phonological awareness and phonics in literacy instruction and materials for multilingual learners. Take it away.
Thanks, Renee. So I feel like the bad kid here on this panel. I'm talking about foundational skills for students learning English. And I just want to say at the outset, this is a both and. I hope I'll make that case. So, and talk a little bit about some of the points that Jim made. And this is all layered on to what Sue said. So this is not a plug for legislation. I'm really alarmed by that whole trend. But I do want to just talk about some first principles. But first, I want to just be very clear with the next slide about what my working assumptions are as I talk to you for the next few minutes. So I am picturing English learners here who, and this is unfortunately statistically true throughout the United States, and is the work of the English ELSF to work on materials. So my perspective is a materials, like what can we do in the materials to mitigate conditions for these students, these children. So they're being taught by a non-specialist, a general ed teacher who has little training. They're in a monolingual English classroom setting. That's which statistically most English learners, most multilingual learners are in this country currently, are in a primary grade in English in elementary school. They're not yet older students with reading challenges. And they are just learning to speak English. They are somewhere between emergent, you know, they're still learning to master English, but it's X time, it's kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade in a monolingual classroom, and it's time to learn to read. So learning to read, they will be. And the other working assumption for all these remarks is that language acquisition and learning to read are and can be mutually beneficial, that they do not have to be clashing with each other. So that's going to be, that underlays everything as I go through these. Okay, so letter recognition, knowing the names of the letters in English and seeing them and knowing them. It's really hard to enter into dialogue if you don't know what people are talking about. So that's one really practical reason why students should learn the names of letters. And it is really great. There's a great chance for doing stuff in multilingual settings for kids to teach each other how their written code works and what the names are for the letters in their home languages. And that is a working assumption here, is that this all is meaning making and important, that kids talk to each other and are sharing notes and teaching each other as peers and colleagues. And Marilyn Adams did some stunning research. I don't think she ever published it, so this was all informal and via emails and discussion, but that some shocking number, I want to say it was 40% of second graders did not know the names of the alphabet. They could sing the alphabet song, but 40% of American second graders did not know the names of the letters. They couldn't map them, which means that first bullet, they didn't know what people were talking about when they were talking about sounds, because they were shaky on the letters and letter recognition. And this is kind of a shocking bullet, this fourth one, that longitudinal studies show correlation with 10th grade reading and letter ID. I'm not talking about phonics. I'm not talking about phonemic awareness. I'm talking about knowing, being able to recognize the letters. So we can't overlook this. It doesn't have to be high energy. It can happen with other activities, but it shouldn't be cast aside. It's a component. Okay, phonemic awareness. Hearing the sounds letters make inside English words. Lily talked about this, how important it is for kids to learn to hear the weirdness of English. And it's crucial to decoding. There's a passel of research. It's a precursor and comes along with decoding. So it's also a chance for kids to start to see and hear the weirdness of English and unpack it. So if you look at the word jab, blending would be j-a-b, and then noticing the J versus, you know, that it makes this GI sound in English, j, like giant. So all right away, you're seeing the weirdness, some of the quote unquote weirdness of English while you're playing with it. Here, look below that where jab means to poke or stab with something pointed, like a finger, to jab your finger at something, or jab your pencil into somebody's arm if you're really being naughty. Meaning making has to always go alongside phonics. There is not enough time in the day for those things to be segregated. So learning to read has to be meaningful. It has to always be associated with meaning. And we should never take for granted that kids, even with CVC words, the kids necessarily know the meaning of the word. Segmenting is learning to pull apart the sounds and hear them. And again, the definition. So I give you an example with grab, a rhyming, same family. So phonemic awareness should be fun, interactive, fast-paced, and it's oral by definition. And meaning of less common words, I would say jab and grab are both less common, should always be offered. And if you're not sure, if you don't feel like you have time, like grab, like who doesn't know about grab? Well, make sure, let your kids get into either linguistic partnerships or mentor kid pairs so they can learn vocabulary while they're learning to read. So this idea of meaning making while you're learning to read has to be integral. So this is just some summary thoughts and some research. Again, you should never pass up a chance to tell what the words you're reading mean. It can be done really quickly. We built out a program for Tennessee, the state of Tennessee, a phonemic awareness program, and we always offered teachers who were going through fast and have a lot on their minds, here are the working definitions. So that's something we'd love to see in materials ready-made for the teachers. And so that's also behind here. I know there's a lot of materials makers on this call, and there's a lot of stakeholders on this call. And there's a lot of people on this call that train teachers and work with professional learning. If the materials don't do this, then the teacher has to be taught, has to be encouraged to do this. Again, build vocabulary while you teach kids to read. Don't isolate them. And just the idea that learning to manipulate the insides of words and how they sound strengthens focus and attention. to how English sounds blend together to make words in English. We are talking about learning to read in English here for multilingual learners, kids who come from a different language base, and also young kids who are English dominant. This stuff helps those kids too. Reinforces the idea that written text is language on paper. So that's if you're hearing it and then you see it, that this sort of rough analogy, reading is the rough equivalent to listening, speaking is the rough equivalent, writing is the rough equivalent to speaking. That this is the code written is equivalent to what you're hearing through your ears and saying through your mouths. The automatic ability to do phonemic awareness is key to later reading success. So you don't want to leave it behind. It's possible kids or adults don't have good phonemic awareness and learn to read without it, but it's often the source of difficulty, especially if these sounds are somewhat new or alien. And it should be social, it should be fun, it should be lively, it should be quick. It is work done out loud. Okay, phonics and the science of reading. Jim made this point beautifully. It's not all there is to the science of reading. We were alarmed enough about what we're seeing going on with hour-long phonics sessions and pretty crude legislative efforts in many states, I think 23 and counting. And hearing from lots and lots of people and seeing it ourselves that all of a sudden, all we do is foundational skills. No, what Sue underlay, the knowledge building is important, read aloud is important, writing is important, teaching what it means for comprehension itself is important. We were alarmed enough about it that is the other parts of reading is a topic of the book that's coming out in April that we just wrote. So systematic phonics is not all there is to the science of reading, but it does feel that way or seem that way these days. And that I think is contributing to the false dichotomy that Jim alluded to. And it's not just phonics, it is systematic phonics. I have a different read than Jim from some of his quotes from the NRP. They were really clear that systematic and sequenced phonics, doesn't matter what the sequence is, but there has to be a sequence, is definitely foundational for science of reading. So we're going to have a slide on what is systematic phonics and then what is definitively not systematic phonics coming up. Okay, what is research-based phonics? It does follow a scope and sequence of phonics elements. There isn't a better or worse one, but there has to be some kind of logic to the order in which kids are taught the alphabetic principles. It should begin with and fold in phonological awareness and letter recognition. That's why I spent time on those. This is really key. Allow kids to practice as much as they need. Seidenberg's work that Jim alluded to, that I think he said Freddie Hebert had brought out in a later article, he talks about this idea of escape velocity. There's a point at which kids sort of click, they lock in on patterns. And then there's this escape velocity. All of a sudden, it feels magic, they can read. We don't know, because there's so much variation in the human brain, when that happens. Some kids need lots of practice. Some kids can get it with just a few repetitions. This has a lot to do with how much they've been exposed to academic English, wherever that has happened, through read aloud, literature-rich environments. Again, wherever that happens. I believe that we should make sure it happens in school for all kids, that it's a real equity issue. But what often happens is kids aren't allowed to practice as much as they need in the younger grades, and they get passed on and become kids who struggle with making sense out of text when they're older. Yes, somebody just said learning to read should be noisy. Absolutely. It's so ironic how backwards we have reading instruction in this country, probably in the whole Western world, English-speaking world. It's screwy. We tend to overly assess for comprehension, which is slow, and change is slow, and we try to atomize and do all this nonsense over on the comprehension side. But with foundational skills, you do really need to know if kids have mastered each element so you can quickly repair. You don't want a kid staggering along with 3 or 4 short vowels they're confused about and not being able to distinguish them. Teachers need to know that, they need to have tools to know that, and then they need to go in and repair. And part of the tool for knowing that for quick repair is spelling of taught phonics patterns, because encoding the pattern is a great diagnostic for whether or not kids have it. So you want to see in materials that spelling of the taught patterns, there's lots of chance to practice both taught phonics patterns and high frequency words. And there's a lot of good research about morphology while you're teaching phonics. It pays off in foundational skills acquisition, and surprise, surprise, morphology pays off in vocabulary acquisition over in the arena Sue got to talk about. And again, always be linked to meaning. No reading a word you don't know. We don't believe in reading and instructing with nonsense words. We think they could be preserved for assessments. And if you're doing work with nonsense words, the kids should know it. They shouldn't be puzzled because you have some weird word that you made up or the material's made up, and the kids feeling like reading is nonsense, because it's not, it's meaning making. So you can then play games with them, but meaning needs to be intrinsic to learning how to read. And again, it should be accompanied by all the other things that Sue was talking about and Jim was referencing. So those are that. What is not research-based? Here's the first one that I think Jim was lamenting a lot during his time: teaching phonics solely and ignoring other language and literacy elements. That is not research-based. Or the opposite, being too glib about it. And Jim, I guess things are maybe healthier in Canada, but I have a different take on the value that the journalists did in shedding light on just how sloppy reading instruction was and how much damage it was doing south of the border. Phonics was being taught on an as needed basis. And if you needed too much, you went off to tier 2 or tier 3 instruction, and that was that. So we have been in a bad place. The right to read is not, they didn't come out of nowhere in the science of reading community. That said, I'm really happy about the bridges that are being built between that community and ELSF and other groups that are keeping the conversation more holistic. Again, that Donna Scanlon and Anderson work is really important. Jim alluded to it. Teaching students to use context, meaning, or syntax as the primary method. That is the problem that quote unquote balanced literacy, the
3Q.
Yeah, 3Qing is what has really been gotten a lot of bad press, and it's written into legislation. Context is vital. What is the content? Reading is context, right? So, but starting with context as the primary method of word recognition doesn't work, because that means kids are gliding over the phonetic patterns that will stand them instead when they don't have enough context. And they need to learn those patterns. They need to get adequate practice. And nor is research-based using only texts that contain the words with spelling patterns students have learned or have learned. There's actually very little research on how decodable words, books, texts need to be for how long. Very little research. So anybody that tells you kids need to be locked into purely decodable readers for X amount of months or whatever, or X amount of first grade, doesn't know what they're talking about, because there isn't a strong research base there. It is a really, that idea of Seidenberg's of escape velocity is really, it's his good theory. It's interesting, but there isn't good research here. So you get locked into decoding is as bad as only trying to ignore the patterns of English. And anything that omits the ingredients from the last slide, if you remember back after 3 speakers and a bunch of slides. Okay, syllabication. So sometimes there is this weird, what feels like a false clash between Spanish, like teaching to read in Spanish and teaching to read in English. I'm specifically calling out Spanish or any transparent language. Spanish is a reliable language. You can take the letter sounds to the bank, which is why it's called transparent. English is a highly opaque language. It is a river that came from many linguistic streams. So that matters. And that is why morphology is so essential. The third bullet, being aware of morphemes and knowing morphemes and being able to draw on your home language to see what that word or that clump of letters might mean inside a word is super helpful, because English is reliable. English spelling patterns are reliable at a morphological level, not a sound level. So in Spanish, you can learn how to read by reading at the syllable level. And that is often, that's pretty quickly gone to. But syllabication in English, the rules do not hold up. We just reviewed some materials where they, oh my God, they leaned into syllable rules for a ton of time. And this is for teacher prep. And we're like, no, they all break down. You can't take them to the bank. You can take morphemes to the bank. They are reliable spelling patterns, but not. So anyway, there's that. Okay, so I'm almost done. Let's move on to the other sort of golden thing, fluency. Reading fluency, hearing a good reader read out loud while you're following along with the same text. These are the three components of it: accuracy, appropriate rate to what you're reading, and then prosody, which is the expressiveness. These are fluency. There are four basic pillars for how to build fluency. Reading to students while they follow along. This is not just pleasure, it is actually seeing the patterns. So we talked a lot about that, hearing and seeing patterns. Reading with students, choral reading or reading without you, paired reading. And then of course, diagnostically listening to students read, and repeated reading of the same text for practice. Reader's theater, if you know that, is really rich in this area. And then following along while a proficient reader reads aloud. Those are the two ways you can build fluency. Those are incredibly invaluable. They should start right away. They are what you can do if you have older students or newcomers who are older who are trying to learn English again in these classrooms with and most of these good programs that Sue alluded to and others have shared in the screens, and many representatives on this call have really good fluency interventions. You want that in your materials. Okay, that's enough for me.
Thank you, Meredith. It really, I think what your talk underscores is that we really need to attend to differentiation of phonics and phonological awareness for diverse student groups. So that's really important. The national narrative has recently shifted to promote bilingualism and multilingualism as a superpower. Our next speaker is Dr. Rebecca Blum Martinez, who has always seen and fought for bilingualism and biliteracy as assets. She is ELSF's dual language national advisor and also the Emerita Professor of Bilingual Education at the University of New Mexico. She specialized in bilingualism, second language learning, language maintenance, and revitalization in language minority communities, particularly Spanish-speaking and American Indian populations. Her research has long centered on second language development across varied learning contexts, and she has been leading an effort to create a set of guidelines for Spanish language materials, which will soon be released. And we're privileged to have her share her wealth of experience and expertise on the development of dual language materials. Take it away, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Renee. And thank you all panelists for giving us so much great information and balanced information. I really appreciate it. The report that I'm going to be citing, which is called La Trascendencia de los Materiales de Calidad para Programas Bilingües y de Inmersión. That's the title in Spanish. The English title is Materials Matter, Parity and Quality for Spanish Language Arts. So this report, which was about a year in the making and has been supported by the Schusterman Foundation, involved me doing an extensive literature review of how is Spanish and Spanish language arts, which is what we call it in English, Spanish language arts. In Spanish, it's just called lengua or español. How is this taught in the various Spanish-speaking countries? And so I reviewed as much material as I could get my hands on from the Spanish-speaking world, and some literature from the US as well. It also, this report involved having district interviews, having interviews with folks who are leading multilingual programs at LAUSD, in Aldine, Texas, in Denver, in Minneapolis, and in New York City, and listening to what they had to say about the materials that are available presently. We also reviewed the extant materials that are being put out for Spanish language arts, and we got feedback from experts. And the experts, I just want to make sure to include their names because they were so helpful in giving feedback for this report, which include Doctors Sonia Soltero, Jill Kerper-Mora, Sandra Musanti, Patricia Velasco, Silvia Dorta Duque de Reyes, Kathy Escamilla, Guadalupe Valdez, and Lily Wong Fillmore. And also district people. So we had Wilma Valero, the former director of U46 in Illinois, Emma Shirk from the Washington State Department of Education, Altagracia Delgado from Aldine, and also Yuderki Santos from New York City. And so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what is in that report and what the points that I'm making are, we are going to be including these in the guidelines that we will be making public for both publishers and for school districts when they are choosing their materials. So what is lacking? And this was a lot based on what we were able to review and what the districts told us. First of all, that very few existing instructional materials support comprehensive Spanish literacy development K through 5. This is really important. This is a point I think that Jim and Sue both made, that it's very important that the literacy instruction go all the way through. The exception, of course, being Puerto Rico. Very few existing instructional materials provide a variety of original Spanish language texts. Much too much translation going on, much too much even transadaptation in terms of having texts that originally were in English and then either translated or transadapted into Spanish. We need authentic, originally written Spanish texts, and there are tons of them for children. Very few materials also do not reflect the cultural and linguistic diversity of the Spanish-speaking population. So the United States is in a very unique situation when it comes to Spanish because we have all the Spanish-speaking varieties spoken in this country. And to focus strictly on one particular variety or one cultural aspect and not representing the variety of Spanishes and cultures that are here is really doing a disservice to the children. And finally, for today, just few materials provide the space and guidance necessary for students to make cross-linguistic connections. Of course, Jim Cummins has written about this. Lots of other people have been talking about the cross-linguistic connections that make for better readers, both in English and in Spanish. And unfortunately, as I well know, this is something that is not covered mostly in teacher preparation for bilingual teachers. So one of the major points that we make in the report is that materials must honor the Spanish language. Spanish is a language that is used for intellectual endeavor, for creative work, for scientific discovery, for engineering. It is its own language and it should be honored as such, not as a translation or an appendage of English. And the materials must reflect the grammatical structures, the discourse used, and the literary traditions of the Spanish-speaking world. Meredith was just talking about syllabification. We have seen some pretty disturbing materials in Spanish where students are being taught to break up syllables based on English. This is a terrible thing, and also will make for not only bad Spanish, but also for students having terrible problems with spelling of Spanish, with accent marks, which are so important in Spanish and is a part of Spanish development. And that materials must also develop knowledge. I'm so glad that Sue talked about this, but so many materials we saw are kind of like, okay, we're going to teach the initial literacy skills in Spanish. Kids can now decode, and that's all that's going to happen. And Spanish is never used for intellectual work, for creative kinds of aspects, for digging deep into topics. It's just simply not there. And materials also, as I said before, must provide examples of Spanish language varieties and their cultures. And those varieties include the varieties spoken in the United States, which of course brings us to translanguaging as well. So what is needed in terms of Spanish language literacy, and I don't have much time, so I'm going to be very quick about this, that oral language development is key to literacy development. And in all the materials that we've seen from the Spanish-speaking world, there is an abundance of riddles, language play, poetry, trabalenguas, all kinds of things that help kids to develop that oracy that is so important to literacy development. And also, once students encounter the text, whether it's the teacher reading to them or doing all the kinds of group readings that Meredith was talking about, that that oracy is going to be the foundation for Spanish literacy. And that early literacy development must follow the structure of the Spanish language, which, as Meredith already mentioned, syllable is the key. And beginning with vowels. Why? Because vowels don't change their sounds. These are the foundational blocks of literacy development. And as I said, syllabification de manera español, not from English, is really important also in terms of accent marks. And that materials must provide texts and guidance to the teachers for the continuum of Spanish literacy, not just early literacy, but to advanced literacy. While Spanish may be easy to decode, what we know from the Spanish-speaking world is that there are problems with reading comprehension in the Spanish-speaking world. And so in advanced levels of literacy, we need to be working with the phrases, the clauses, the different ways in which Spanish expresses certain ideas so that students can come to be familiar with it and write with it as well. And that's why we put here that writing is an integral part of literacy development. We need to make sure that students are writing in the discourse that is Spanish, and not something that is a la English, as I said before. And one thing that was called out in the Spanish-speaking world is that text selection is crucial for language and literacy growth, because they need to be able to have the models of how Spanish expresses certain ideas. And this is especially important for developing advanced literacy in Spanish. Text selection is crucial for providing appropriate models of language, as I said, but for a variety of genres and purposes, not just one way of writing, not just one genre. And it's also important for developing strong student identities, which is something that Jim has talked about so much. When you have examples of literature from around the Spanish-speaking world, then the students who come from these cultures are seeing themselves represented, are seeing great writers represented, and they know then that Spanish is a valuable and wonderful language that can do all the things that the authors are doing. And the same thing goes for developing strong identities for students in the United States by reading Latine writers from the United States, many of whom are writing in English and some who are beginning to write in Spanish. And I think that that's all I have for today. I know we're out of time, and so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blum Martinez, such important points. And if we're going to make Spanish, if we're going to make bilingualism a superpower, we need to really pay attention to these guidelines that Rebecca will share. We are out of time. So what we're going to try to do is find a way to answer your questions that we haven't yet answered in the Q&A in a follow-up email. Dr. Lily Wong-Fillmore will be presenting on the fundamental components of a knowledge building unit in the next, and she's going to take up our whole time because she has so much wonderful knowledge to share with us. And then session 4, Dr. Ruslana Westerlin, Dr. Maria Brisk, and Dr. Luciana de Oliveira will share the role of writing in literacy development. And then finally, if you could please take the post survey for us and give us some feedback on how we can make these better and you know, your learnings for today. I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much to Dr. Cummins, to Pimentel, Meredith, Liben, and Dr. Blum Martinez for sharing all of your knowledge and expertise with us today. We are very grateful. And thanks for all the audience for joining and participating so meaningfully.